Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machida. We're continuing our series looking at the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus and his work Against Apion and investigating whether he gives a canonical list. And this is an incredibly important uh, piece of evidence within canonical studies because many people, in fact, the predominant view is that Josephus gives us the earliest, the first canonical list of Old Testament books, and he does so in a Jewish reckoning. So, very important key element because he's so early. And we're looking at and dismantling this canonical interpretation of Josephus because I don't believe it's a legitimate interpretation. And we're going through episode by episode. I'm going to dismantle it piece by piece. And in this episode, we're going to continue our look at canonical framing of Josephus. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. All right, so let's begin by looking at canonical framing. Yeah, I chose those words because there was an expression that if someone was set up, if someone was made to look as if they did something that they didn't do, we call it that they were framed. And I think there's canonical framing going on with Josephus. And this occurs in many, many different ways. And that's what we're packing in this beginning of the series here. How scholars have kind of loaded the deck and approaches Josephus as if he's given a canonical list because they already believe that he's given a canonical list. And so it's kind of like the conclusion feeds the evidence and the evidence feeds the conclusion. And we've already looked at some significant canonical framing. First, in the last episode, we looked at the source, how I believe this kind of interpretation as a canon began with Eusebius, the church historian, Christian writer, who quotes Against Apion. And in his quote from Josephus, he has Josephus saying that he's setting aside 22 divine books. And that would certainly place him in making a canon because he's segregating a certain number of books as divine as opposed supposedly for non-divine books. The problem is that is not an authentic reading of Josephus. That's an interpolation that was added to the text. It's not authentic. Either Eusebius himself added it because he believed it was a canonical list, or perhaps his manuscript had it. We don't know. All we know is all the manuscript evidence goes against this interpolation, and all the best critical Greek text and the best English translations all omit the word divine. They'll put it in a footnote noting that it's an addition by Eusebius. And that's what we looked at last time. We also finished the program by noting something else, another framing of Josephus. And that is when you look at the English translations of Eusebius and how Eusebius introduces his quote from Josephus, we noted that these English translators add the word canonical to his introduction. And this is found in the De Ferrari translation, the canonical scriptures of the so-called Old Testament. You see this in Schaff and Wass, the quote canonical books of the Old Testament. You find this in Meyer, where he says he enumerates the canonical scriptures forming the Old Testament. And the same thing's true with the Williamson in the Penguin edition. They all insert the word canon there. And what I showed and what you're seeing on the screen right now is the Greek text from which they're operating from does not have the word canon in it. It's just not there. So these translators have all inserted the word canon into Eusebius's introduction to Josephus because they believe that he, that is Josephus, is giving a canonical list. But like I said, that's not in Eusebius. Also, note something else that I didn't do in last episode. Notice that these represent the undisputed books amongst the Hebrews. So it shows that Eusebius didn't believe that Josephus was giving a closed, fixed canon to which it has all the inspired books and only inspired books. He's only given the undisputed books amongst the Jews. And chances are the reason why Eusebius couches it that way is because, as we will see in later programs, it's apparent that Josephus omitted at least one proto-canonical book of the Old Testament. So I think Eusebius realizes that and therefore says that the list he produces are the books that are not disputed by the Jews. But we will continue from there. The reason I noticed that this canonical framing going on in his introduction is because of the word canon. The word canon is a word that's distinctly Christian. Jews didn't use the word canon. They preferred to talk about text in terms of their sacredness and so on. Christians began to use the word canon for the contents of Scripture relatively late in church history. In fact, the first known undisputed use of the word canon in that sense comes from Athanasius of Alexandria, who was born around 296. He died in 373. And roughly around the year 350, uses canon to denote the books of Scripture. Okay, so that's the first known use of canonical in that sense. But I knew that Eusebius couldn't possibly have used the word canon because Eusebius, who was born around 265, he died in 339. So he died well before Athanasius died. In his work, Church History, which was written about 313, he couldn't have used the word canon because the only known indisputed use, the earliest, I should say, is Athanasius in 350. So that's when my flags went up when I saw these English translations talking about canonical scriptures, because I knew that couldn't possibly be true. Otherwise, all the scholars would point to Eusebius being the first one to use the word canon in this sense. And then I checked the Greek and found out, lo and behold, yeah, it's not there. And interesting enough, even in later times, when the word canon as the contents of Scripture become more common, even those translations of Eusebius doesn't use the word canon. Now, this came to me as a surprise. For example, the church father Rufinus in the 4th century gives a quote from Eusebius in Latin. Now, Rufinus uses the word canon. And in fact, in his translations of Origen, he often inserts the word canon when it's not there in Origen. But he doesn't insert the word canon here with Eusebius, curiously enough. So, so this really is an odd add-on in terms of canonical framing of Josephus. But it's understandable because, like I said, you have that interpolation that Eusebius has that makes it sound as if Josephus is giving a canon when he actually isn't. Or at least I don't want to jump the gun and give the conclusion. Let's just say that that word isn't authentic. So I can see where these translators might jump the gun and put canonical in there because the quote from Eusebius sounds as if he's giving a canon. But nevertheless, all over the place. Whenever you see Against Apion being raised in terms of the canon, you always hear that he's giving a canonical list. He's giving the canon a canonical list. But realize what they're doing whenever you see somebody say, Josephus gave us the first canon, they're using the word canon in an anachronistic way. They're inserting a Christian term that was used hundreds of years after Josephus, and they're retrojecting it back into Josephus. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're kind of loading your conclusions into the text. Josephus never uses the word canon, obviously, in the whole of all his works, at least not in the sense of the contents of Scripture. You might use the word canon, but not in that sense. In fact, not only Josephus, but also the New Testament never uses the word canon in that sense. And it wasn't a common term. If anything, whenever the scriptures were spoken of, they were spoken of in terms of their inspiration or their sacredness, because God is the primary author. So therefore, these writings have a sacredness about them, something set apart by God, makes them distinct. And their sacredness in rabbinic literature is often described as defiling the hands. Josephus doesn't really talk much about the sanctity of the 22 books. It may be inferred in section 41, but he never explicitly states, and he never uses the terminology of defiling the hands. So we find in Against Apion, the aspect of canon isn't explicitly used anywhere. Okay, he doesn't call it a canon. He doesn't use the word canon. He even doesn't use defiling the hands. He doesn't even necessarily make them sacred, but he does talk about these 22 writings being written by prophets that were inspired by God. So he has that going for him. But other than that, there's nothing super explicit about him giving a canon, quote unquote. Probably the worst of the canonical framing comes from something you see and hear all the time on the popular level and in academia. We're going to have some fun with this. This idea that Josephus gives us a list. Now, that would make a lot of sense if Josephus is giving a canon. Why? Well, because the purpose of proposing a canon is to stipulate exactly which books belong in the inspired category and thereby excluding those that do not fit within this category. Sometimes that's done explicitly, sometimes implicitly, but usually when you're talking about canon, somebody will give a list because you need to tell people which books belong in this particular category of canonical scripture. And over again, you see people describing Josephus as giving a list. And the funny thing is, folks, if you look at Josephus, he doesn't give a list. This is just like that insertion of canonical and all the other stuff too. You keep hearing over and over again, Josephus's list, Josephus's list. It's not a list. It's an enumeration. And in fact, that's exactly what Eusebius described it as. He didn't describe it as a list. He described it as an enumeration, which is very different because with a list, you stipulate exactly which titles are included, which is what you would need to do proposing a canon. But when you're enumerating, it's far more vague and general and not terribly useful in terms of canonizing a group of books. Okay. Now, but if you already believe that Josephus is giving a canon, then you want it to be a list. It should be a list. It ought to be a list. And yet it's not. And I think a great example of this tensions that's created by the canonical interpretation can be found in a recent book made by Gallagher and Mead titled The Biblical Canon List from Early Christianity, Text and Analysis. Now, this is a pretty high-level book. It's put out by Oxford University Press by two people that are pretty well known within canonical scholarship. In fact, I have several videos where we critique some of Dr. Mead's appearances on various shows critiquing his analysis of the canon. But what's funny here is the whole purpose of this book is to analyze the text of biblical canon list in early Christianity. And The authors also include Josephus in this book, and they're aware of the strangeness of this. Now, I want to read a couple of quotes. This first quote comes from page 13 in the introduction. So it's Roman numeral 13. And the authors say this: our description of a canon list as a list of books that an author or council considered canonical should be nuanced when considering certain lists. Okay, so we need to have a nuanced view of the definition when we're looking at certain lists. Okay, it continues: we have included a passage from Josephus, often labeled the first Jewish canon list. Okay, so they recognize everybody's calling it a canonical list. But anyone reading the passage will be disappointed to find that Josephus fails to list the books on and his account. While it affords a great deal of certainty on the majority of the writings that make up his collection of 22 books, I'm not so sure about that. Nevertheless, it is not so precise that we have complete assurance that we know the contents of the canon. But we do know that Josephus had a canon in the sense of a bounded collection of scripture. Okay, well, so you can see here, they propose what a canon is, then they have to give their own defense of introducing Josephus, and they say it's often called or labeled the first Jewish canon list, when in fact it's not a list at all. And this book of Christian list is going to include Josephus in it, even though it's not Christian, nor is it a list. Rather strange, isn't it? And then they notice that since it is an enumeration and not a list, the contents are uncertain. Now, they believe that a majority of the contents can be known with certainty, which I think, perhaps not. But they also say that it also leaves some things that we can't be certain of. But they know he has a canon, though. They know the canon existed. In page 15 of the introduction, so it's Roman numeral 15, you see this come up again. They slip and they call Josephus a canon list. Okay, it says, but instead, since Josephus does transmit a canon list, well, hold on, I thought he doesn't give a list. Okay, well, so you can see the tension. They want to promote Josephus as giving a canonical list, because that would make sense if he's given a canon and accidentally called it a list. Later in the same introduction, this is in page 17, Roman numerals, it might be 18, I believe it's 17, it says this, quote, all the Old Testament list collected might fittingly receive such a description. By the time of our first canon list, e.g. Josephus, there were still some open issues. Okay, so here it flat out says Josephus gives our first canon list, which it previously just said that although people call it the first canon list, it really isn't. Okay. Continuing on in page 19 of the introduction, it says, quote, in a departure from a general principle of including early Christian lists, we have chosen to incorporate two Jewish lists, those of Josephus, which is technically not even a list, and the Babylonian Talmud, unquote. So, okay, why depart from your principle of looking at Christian lists to insert two Jewish lists, quote unquote? Second, why insert Josephus if he doesn't even give you a list? Because they believe that he gives virtually a list. They want him to give a list because they believe he's given a canon. So you see this tension even within modern scholarship, and this is Oxford University Press, folks, and it keeps going back and forth, back and forth. Eventually, in section 5, in the subtitle, they correctly identify it as an enumeration. Section 5 says the enumeration of the Old Testament books. And then in page 57 of the same book, it says Josephus' list is the earliest in this book, even though we cannot properly describe it as a quote unquote list. He does not provide us with a specific catalog of books, but he does provide us with an exclusive number of books, 22. So again, they describe it as Josephus's list, and then they have to qualify it. Well, it's not really a list. So you can see here, this canonical framing creates a great tension because people want to show Josephus as giving a canon. The most logical way you would give a canon is to give a list, because like I said, the whole purpose of a canon is to distinguish between those specific books that are inspired as opposed to other books, right? And if you don't specify the books, it's kind of fails in its whole purpose, right? Because you're not really helping distinguish exactly what are the confines of the so-called canon. Okay, so let's look at what Josephus actually gives us. And this is in his work Against Apion, Book 1, sections, we're going 39 to 40. Okay. And here's what Josephus says. 5 of these are the books of Moses, which contain both the law and the tradition from the birth of humanity up to his death, this period of a little less than 3,000 years. From the death of Moses until Artaxerxes, king of the Persians after Xerxes, the prophets after Moses wrote the history of what took place in their own times in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and instructions for people on life. So you can see here, he doesn't stipulate any single book. Closest he comes to it is by speaking of the 5 books of Moses. Now, for those listening, you're probably saying, well, duh, we know what the 5 books of Moses are: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? Christians know that. Jews know that. It's the Torah, right? Everybody knows the books of the Torah. So yeah, he doesn't name the books of the Torah, but obviously his audience would have known exactly which books belong in the 5 books of Moses, right? Wrong, because Against Apion is not written to Christians. Against Apion is not written to Jews. Against Apion is written to Roman Gentiles. Would the Roman Gentiles know exactly which books comprise the 5 books of Moses? I sincerely doubt it. In fact, I don't think they'd really care, to tell you the truth. So, yeah, even then, the inference works against the canonical interpretation. And as you can see, he doesn't name, he just basically gives numbers and descriptions, and that's all he gives. And that's why there is a great uncertainty about precisely which books he includes and which ones don't. And part of that has to do with the fact that there was an ongoing process of combining books within Judaism. And that opens up all sorts of questions as to which books were included and which ones were excluded, which ones were combined, and which ones were counted separately. It's all guesswork, folks. And that's why you have Gallagher and Mead admitting that you don't have complete assurance on all of the books that he mentions. And in fact, this is not my own opinion. You could look at F.F. Bruce's book on the canon of scripture, and he says that Josephus's lack of specificity makes certainty about the contents of his list impossible. Okay, that's a problem if you're proposing to make a canon and distinguish the divine books from the non-divine books, to use Eusebius's word, and not specify which books those are. That's a problem, right, for the canonical interpretation. Actually, I believe it makes perfect sense within the context of Against Apion, but that's going to be a later episode. In fact, like I said, since we don't know specifically which books he includes, except I guess we could grant the 5 books of Moses. But even granting that, the rest of the books is largely up in the air just because of his general description and numbers. Without specifying the books, and not knowing which books he combines and not knowing which books he counts separately within those numbers, it really is impossible. In fact, as Lim points out in his book on the canon, he says that to try to figure out which books he includes is no more than an educated guesses. And that's all it is, folks. Even though you'll see in the literature people who will speak with absolute certainty, they know exactly which books Josephus has in his 22 book enumeration. I almost said canon, but enumeration. They might sound incredibly certain, but like Lim says, they're just making an educated guess and really no more than that. For example, scholars like Wolfenson and Sarna, they believe Josephus excludes the Song of Song and Ecclesiastes. This Jewish scholar Zebit believes that he excludes Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. And the reason he says that is because if you look at how he describes these books don't really fit too well in his descriptions. And then F.F. Bruce believes that essentially the same thing as the rabbinic canon. But like I said, even Bruce says it's impossible to know the exact, with exact certainty, which books belong. It's an educated guess. So, despite the fact you see all over the internet and popular sites, and you see in academia, the repeated phrase, Josephus gives us our first canonical list. Folks, that is framing. They are framing Josephus in a canonical way that I believe is illegitimate. But the bad part is it sets up your expectations so that when you read Josephus, you're reading it through the lens of that framing, that canonical framing. And we need to get rid of the lens and just interpret Josephus on his own terms. I believe once you do that, what's going on in Against Apion makes perfect sense. So we're just going to park it right there. Josephus doesn't give us a canon. The idea of him giving a canon is anachronistic. The word canon's not a term used by Jews. It certainly wasn't used by Christians at that early date in that sense. And he definitely doesn't give a list. And this is recognized by scholars. I think it's recognized by anybody that actually reads Josephus. He gives us an enumeration. He gives us numbers and descriptions. And the certainty of that is far from what you would expect if he actually is proposing what we would call today a canon. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment. That helps our exposure, grow the channel. Thank you so much. Till next time, I'm Gary Machuda. Bye-bye.